not a knife. This is a knife. Welcome to 31 Days of Halloween. So if you haven't already guessed, based on my atrocious accent, we're going to be talking about a very popular Australian film from 2005 called Wolf Creek. This movie had really good reviews for it. And then the more that I dug deeper, the more I found out that it actually also has a lot of really bad reviews. And after watching the movie, I can understand a little bit why people might be rating it so high, or they may feel like it's one of the best horror movies of all time, or like it should be on like your top 10 lists and stuff. But overall, I was not enamored with this movie. So Wolf Creek is allegedly based on a true story, like a lot of horror movies tend to be. However, this one seems to be based even more loosely on actual true events than a lot of other horror movies are. So this whole based on true events thing, literally the only thing that this movie has in common with the actual true events is that some random Australian person was kidnapping, torturing, and murdering tourists and just random people that they found out on the road. So there were actually two of them. One's name was Ivan Milat. The other one's name was Bradley Murdoch. And this movie is based a lot more on Ivan Milat. And actually, when you get to the mine scene, maybe about halfway through the movie, the name of the mine is Ivan Milat's name spelled backwards. So that was kind of a neat little, I guess, fourth wall break there, where the director of the film and the writer were kind of saying, hey, this is where we got the inspiration for this movie, because apparently they had tried to put this together a couple years earlier, but didn't really like the way that it was coming together, so they wound up shelving it for a little while, and then came out with this story. So that's where everything ends. Like, well, any of the similarities, any of the based on true events, nothing in the movie that happened is true. There are a couple of statistics that are thrown up in the beginning, which is very reminiscent of other sort of like based on true event things, where they're like, oh, such and such number of people go missing in this town. It actually made me think of The Fourth Kind, the movie with Mila Jovovich about aliens, because they too did that same thing. Oh, in Nome or Anchorage, Alaska, such and such number of people go missing every year. Some of them are found, some of them are not. The FBI has a huge presence here. So that's where I was kind of like, all right, I don't know how much of this is really based on real events. And it turns out that it's really not. The disappointment in this movie doesn't stop there. It's overly long. I think it's either an hour and 40 minutes or almost an hour and 50 minutes, which is long for your standard horror movie, and especially when the first half of the movie not much really happens. You get introduced to our three characters. I'm not entirely sure how they all know each other or why they all decided to go on this trip together. They don't seem to know much about each other. So they decided to go on this trip to Wolf Creek, which is a real life meteorite crash site in Australia. Like, you can go there and like you can Google pictures of it and stuff, and it looks really cool. So they decided to go there and make this trip for whatever reason. I really don't know why. And from there, things kind of get a little crazy, and it turns into what we would call your typical hillbilly torture movie, in the same vein as like all the movies that were spawned from Deliverance. So you have this kind of, I guess in American terms, I'm not sure what the Australian term for it would be, this redneck hillbilly guy who is obviously very different from our Sydney-born and bred Australian male character and the two British women who he happens to know and who have gone out into the Australian outback with him. The actor who plays our Outback guy, like the American version of, or the Australian version of American Hillbilly, is John Jarret, and he is arguably the best part of this movie. And I can see why people would like this movie so much because of him, because he genuinely plays both parts of his role really, really well. From like friendly, let me help you, like I'm a good guy, to I'm going to kidnap you and murder you. And that's one of the reasons why I can see people may really like this movie, but that's about it. The movie itself overall has a found footage sort of feel to it, the way that the camera moves. And then, as I was doing a little bit of research, I found out that a lot of this movie was shot with handheld cameras, and that definitely comes across, and that seems to be their intention, which is fine. I love found footage films. I think when done properly, they're really, really good. One of the other things that I noticed was that a lot of the violence is implied. You really don't see a lot of the torture or the violence against anybody, and the excuse or the reasoning can't even be made that it was an older movie from like the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, where a lot of the violence was more implied because of censors and because of an inability to really do those either special effects or those practical effects. This is a movie from 2005, so if they really wanted to go hardcore into any practical or special effects, it should have been possible. For some people, maybe that made the movie worse, because now you get to imagine like what happened to these people or like other victims and whatever. It didn't do it for me, and it kind of made the criticisms of the movie really interesting, where Roger Ebert specifically said that the violence and the violence enacted against the protagonists in the movie was gratuitous, and it was horrible, and people wanted to walk out. And I didn't get that, because yes, the characters are bloody, and yes, they do obviously experience some form of torture. You really don't see it. You get a little bit at the end, but not enough for me to feel that it was justified to say that this movie was so gratuitously violent that people would want to walk out of it, or that it was horrific. One of the quotes that I got out of an article that I read was that the film's preference for female suffering gives it such a misogynist undertone that makes it even more unsettling than the gore, which again I found there to be like non-existent gore. But it's an interesting statement to make, considering most horror films focus entirely on female suffering. Research has shown that in torture scenes or in rape scenes or in terror scenes where you see a person like actually fear on their face, the focus is, there's a lot more time spent on the torture and the violence against and the fear within females than there is in men. And it's a considerable number. I forget exactly how it is, but I think it's like minutes worth of difference. Like if it's 2 minutes worth of men that they focus on, it's 6 or 7 minutes that they focus on this stuff with women. And that's not something new to horror. That's something that's always been a thing in horror. And that's why I've always argued that, you know, there is this violence against women, but women typically triumph in horror. That's where you get the whole final girl trope from. So to say that this movie's focus on female suffering made it bad, there are other things that made this movie bad, but the focus on female suffering in no way, shape, or form made me feel that this movie was bad or misogynist. It was, you know, what you would expect from a slasher, hillbilly, torture porn horror film. You know, the characters get tortured, and the characters are female. There's 2 females and 1 male. Obviously, the torture is going to be more female-centric. There's 2 of them. So, that I don't like the movie, but I didn't agree with a lot of the criticism of it. There were other things to criticize, like the fact that the movie is stricken with plot holes. The characters are barely fleshed out and fairly weak. Again, the only good character is Jarret's character. I want to see more of him. Like, the only reason why I would even watch Wolf Creek 2 is for Jarret's character. There were a couple other issues that might be a little spoilery, so I'll save those for the end. But it's again primarily the plot holes. The characters are not fleshed out; they're kind of boring. There's a random like love interest thing that gets half developed and is not essential in any way, shape, or form to the plot, and immediately gets abandoned once everybody gets kidnapped. So there's just a lot of stuff in here that is unnecessary to the film and just makes it drag. There was no reason for this movie to be an hour and 40 or an hour and 50 minutes. It very easily could have been an hour and 20, hour and 30 minutes. And apparently we're lucky that it was even only as long as it was, because the initial party scene in the very beginning of the movie was apparently like 40 minutes long. I don't even know what they thought they were doing with that, but no. It would have been a terrible decision. So overall, my score for this film and the person that I watched it with, we both gave this movie a 2. I found the movie to be more frustrating than scary. It was nothing that I've seen, nothing that I haven't seen before, as far as the gore, the torture, the plot line, and normally I wouldn't hold that against a movie because, you kind of can't help that sort of thing after you've watched so many horror movies or after you've read so much about them. You kind of start to know the plot lines, you start to know the thematic devices. After watching something like Hostel or Saw, you don't get that much more gory than that, at least in American film. I know there's a lot of other movies that I haven't seen yet. Cannibal Holocaust comes to mind. A couple other French extreme films, things like that. So, to sit there and say, it wasn't as gory as people made it out to be, I wouldn't necessarily hold that against it if it hadn't been for the other shortcomings in the film. So, that's why I gave it a 2. Moving into the spoilers, so if you haven't seen this movie or you don't want to hear the spoilers, I turn it off now. Go see the movie. Come back later. Thanks for sticking with me so far up to this point. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. But moving into the spoilers now. So some of the things that were a little spoilery that really bothered me were they get to the meteorite camp, the meteorite area, and both of their watches stop. Or not both, because there's 3 of them. So 2 of their watches stop because only 2 of them are wearing watches. And then the car breaks down. Obviously the car is breaking down because someone's tampered with it because they're going to get kidnapped. But why the watches? Why the car battery at the same time? I know that the male character, Ben, tells a story about aliens, so they're kind of making you think that it's a supernatural sort of thing, but it kind of just... It got me so stuck that I had to pause the movie and go research, is this a thing at this meteorite thing? Is there excess metal in the ground that messes with batteries? Why didn't they know this? Why was there no warning anywhere? It took me out of the movie so badly that I had to take points off for that because it was just such a ridiculous thing. And it wasn't even that their watches stopped at 2 separate times, which would be more realistic or at least more believable. They both stopped at the same time, and then the car battery dies. So that definitely took me out of the movie, and that hurt it for me because they're trying to add in this supernatural element that was completely unnecessary because we all know what we're getting when we go into this movie. So that was that I didn't like that. One of the things I did like was Ben films himself at one point at the gas station that they stop at, where you have the guys who you think are going to be the murderers, but then they wind up not being the murderers once Mick's character comes along. But as Ben's filming himself, the one girl later on finds the cameras and she's watching them, and she sees in his film in the background Nick's truck. So she kind of realizes, oh hey, like he's been following us since the gas station. He planned this whole thing. So I thought that was kind of a neat little callback. One of the other things that I absolutely hated about this film was how weak our heroines are. Like you clearly, or at least you think you know, who the heroine's gonna be, and then she turns out to kind of be really awful. Um, I and I understand certain things that you just don't do in horror movies because you got to keep the plot going. But to be so stupid as to shoot this guy in the neck and then you try to shoot him again and the gun doesn't work for whatever reason, and then you hit him pathetically twice in the back and call it a day? No, you bludgeon his head into the ground. What are you doing? Attempt. I would have respected the movie more if she had gone to bludgeon him in the head and he reached up and like grabbed the gun from her. Like that would have been much better than what they wound up doing with it. And then for the two girls to die, fine. Like it's unexpected. But then Ben somehow manages to traverse the desert and there's an eclipse for some reason. And Mick never seems to find him, even though he's able to find the two girls somehow all the time. Oh my gosh, like that was problematic. The girls' escape was problematic. Pushing the truck over the cliff was problematic. And then they go back and Lizzie, I think, is the girl who's supposed to be the heroine. Because you have Christy. What is she doing? She's doing literally everything except what she should be doing, which is getting out of there. Stop trying to get the police so that you can bring them back to wherever it is that you are, or at least to save your life and Christy's life. The movie was a mess for me in that regard, so that's why I gave it a 2. I loved Jarret as Mick. That was the only good thing about the movie. That's the only reason why I didn't give this movie a 0 or a 1. Like he's that the entirety of the 2 points that I gave this movie. So. I can't recommend this movie, having given it such a low rating, but, maybe Wolf Creek 2 will be better. Maybe you still want to give it a shot for yourself. So, if you do, I hope you like it better than I do, like some of these other people have. But at any rate, thanks for joining in for 31 Days of Halloween. Please click the like button or the subscribe button, share this video, leave me a comment, tell me how horribly or well I'm doing. Whatever. A comment's a comment. So, thanks for coming by, guys, and I will see you at the next video. Wait, where's the knife? That's a knife. So,